Hi, welcome everyone this afternoon. I'm Maria Marshall. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Welcome to the special seminar, which I know that everybody who registered is very keen on hearing all this information on the impact indicators and the meeting that's going to happen later on in May. Let me talk about the next webinar. Scott, if you'll just move it forward one slide. It's our promotion of the next webinar that's coming.
Sorry. There we go.
There we go. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be the Leadership Chautauqua, Revolutionizing Extension's Approach to Community Leadership Development Systems. Our speakers are from the University of Nebraska, and we're one of our small grants recipients. So this is work that they did. It was funded by NCRCRD, so we look forward to really hearing about the lessons learned from that project. And so then without further ado, I will introduce our three speakers for this afternoon. The speakers not in this particular order, I hear, but our first, let me introduce Scott Chasden. Scott recently retired from the University of Minnesota Extension, where he served as an evaluation specialist. He is now working as a consultant to support social and environmental justice efforts. Scott developed ripple effects mapping. And Ann Silvis is Assistant Dean and Program Leader, Community and Economic Development at the University of Illinois Extension and serves on the Community and Economic Development team for University of Illinois Extension. Her work focuses on community development, leadership development, community assessment, and group process skills, and directs funded projects in leadership development and community planning. And then Michael Wilcox is Purdue Extension's Assistant Director and Program Leader for Community Development and Associate Director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Michael provides motivation, strategy, vision, and coordination for the development and delivery of community development extension programs that address the diverse needs in Indiana communities and beyond. And I know you have more on your intro, Michael, but I'll leave it at that from your many, many hats. And with that, I know that none of these three speakers are really strangers to anybody on this call, I'm sure. So with that, Scott, Ann, and Michael, I hand it off to you all.
Thanks, Maria. And I'm going to get us started just by thanking you for hosting us. Thanks to the NCRCRD for hosting us. And not just hosting this webinar, but also supporting the work along with the North Central Cooperative Extension Association and the Southern Rural Development Center. And that is, it's important because one of the purposes of this whole effort is to work with all four of our regions and come up with indicators that we all have access to. Not necessarily we're all going to be using every single one in exactly the same time frame or the same way, but we did want to make sure that this process of reviewing and possibly revising and refreshing and renewing those indicators is a reflection of what's going on across all of the regions. So thanks for hosting and just for making this making this not just a region-wide, but across all system support. So as this is just a little bit of review to kind of set the stage for the work that we're about to start, and that is to talk a little bit about the indicators and where they came from. So we started them in 2009. In the North Central region, and we started collecting those indicators. We started compiling them across the 12 states. The Southern region started using them and has also been working with us since 2017. The programming in the other two regions, the Western and Northeastern, isn't as robust in CED, so their reporting is different, but one of the things that we'll do in this effort is to look at how these impact indicators can be meaningful in those areas as well. So Scott, I think I'm just going to keep asking you to advance the slides. Thank you. So the purpose of this is really to help us tell with numbers and with stories, a very compelling story about the value of CED work. And that work is tailored to communities. It's different community by community, state by state, region by region. But our hope is that we can identify these impact indicators that we can all use and then have some really strong numbers to talk about when we report at the regional and national levels. So the workshop that we'll be doing later this month will really focus on the development of a set of indicators that'll work for you, no matter what state you're in, no matter what system you're in, no matter what region you're in. So can you advance it?
Sure.
Thank you. So I'm gonna hand it off to Michael at this point.
So the benefits, we have to think about, to us, we want to be able to tell our story. I'll just mention that, yes, the indicators were created in 2009. Yes, the Southern region started doing the same thing, but there's been uneven adoption, if you will. The 1862s in the North Central region colluded to collect these metrics, but the two 1890s in the region weren't necessarily brought on board right away. And the 1994s have never been reached out to really to collect these metrics. And so we realize that now we need to begin to reach out to all of the land grant institutions in our region so we can collectively tell our story. I'm reminded of the fact that ECOP just did a survey last year looking at educator FTEs, and nationally, not including the 1994s, but across the 1890s and the 1862s, community resource and economic development represented only 5% of the FTEs across the entire United States for community development. So if we're not going to tell our story, then no one else is. And because we are relatively small, our story can get lost. And so the part of the benefit of being there and telling our story and representing our story so people can understand, though while we're small, we are mighty, and they need to hear the great stories that we're doing. And so they need to understand the collective impact. By understanding the collective impact, we can then convince state and federal funders that extension programs are a good investment, especially those related to community resource and economic development. And then also the data collection can be used for scholarship and program improvement for sure. And next slide. So the current North Central region indicators include all of these on the screen, and Mary Breidenbach, who's on, is a goddess when it comes to taking all this information and turning it into something that not only we can understand, but the general public can understand as well. And so you can see the beautiful infographics that she created in the executive summary of our report in the North Central region. But these indicators currently include things like number of community and organizational plans and policies developed, implemented, the dollar value of grants and resources generated by community, number of participants reporting new leadership roles, dollar value of volunteer hours, number of volunteer hours, dollar value of organization or community generated hours, business plans developed, businesses created, jobs retained, and dollar values of efficiencies and savings. And quite honestly, if you look at the reports, and you can look at all of them going back to the OG report in 2010, you can see that some of our institutions that are represented in these reports do all of these things. Some of us only do some of these things, and some of us only do a few of these things. And so while quantifying it can be very, very powerful, it can also be a challenge because our community resource and economic development programs look so different. And so this is why not only do we need to be counting these quantifiable indicators, but we need to be thinking about telling stories as well. Another challenge with these, just very quickly, is the fact that it was the 1862 community development program leaders in the North Central region that developed these without any input, as I recall, from the two 1890s, nor any input from the 1994s, because this was collectively done during NCCEA meetings. And so now is the time for us to really reach out broadly across the entire system, working in community development, to make sure that we keep those that represent what we do well and generate new ones that may represent us better into the future. And I'll end by saying with these that Ann and I have been talking about this for a while with other colleagues, that we didn't feel as though this really represented the breadth and depth of work that we're doing in terms of supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, and access and belonging type efforts that we've been doing in community resource and economic development since we started as a program area so many years ago. Next slide. And so the Southern region, they've always had a really strong, cohesive program leader group. While they may not have as many FTEs out in the field, they certainly have wonderful specialists out there and some great educators, and they work very cohesively and well together. And with support from the SRDC, they started collecting these indicators as well. They have really cool graphics also that show the work that they're doing and quantify some of the impact that they're having. Very similar to the North Central region, there's dollar value of grants generated, there's dollar value of other in-kind resources, number of plans, number of participants who report new leadership roles, number of businesses created, retained, or expanded, number of jobs created, retained, number of new alliances or networks formed through some type of formal agreement. Before we move to the next slide, I'll just simply say what we've been seeing here, and I think that this will resonate with others. For the longest time, Extension's really been about butts and seats and really talking about educational events and the number of people associated with those educational events. And as I've watched community development evolve over time, we know that we are maybe working with fewer people, partly just due to our footprint, but also partly that we're working with these folks in a very deep, iterative way, trying to collectively make things happen in our communities. And it's not necessarily about clicking through a PowerPoint presentation in an hour and just trying to meet short-term educational knowledge goals, but really looking at those behavior changes and those conditional changes in the medium and long term. So that makes trying to generate these metrics and providing an ability for us to articulate them, it creates a problem for us, or a great challenge for us to try to be able to measure those medium and long-term indicators, as well as recognizing that there's some short-term knowledge gain as well. And Scott, take it away.
Okay. So I am retired, so I'm no longer an evaluation specialist with Extension in Minnesota, but for many years, for most of my career, in fact, I was part of a national CRED impacts work group that the mission of which was to sort of help the states think about ways to measure these indicators, as well as just in general measure the impacts of community development programming in Extension. And so over the years, I've kind of been very familiar as someone who's had to pull together the data for these indicators for the state of Minnesota. I've been aware of some of the challenges of trying to get, the right measures and figure out how to get the data together in a way that we can stand behind at the state level. And so I was pleased to be asked to participate in this project of first doing a survey nationally, which I'm about to start talking about, and then to help facilitate this meeting coming up in May, which Michael will talk about towards the end of our time today, to start thinking about some different ways of doing indicators and perhaps different ways of doing narratives around our impacts in community development. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes of this survey. Briefly, though, one thing I want to mention is there's a lot of, you've probably seen a lot about what's an indicator, and you've seen, the logic models and from, for example, the famous one that Wisconsin started years ago. But I just wanted to remind people that when we talk about impact indicators, we want them to be these things. We always wanted them to be these things. And to some extent, the survey tells us that they aren't all of these things, but we want them to be specific and measurable, achievable, relevant, and have some sort of timeline to them, because we want to report them every year and have some sense that what we're reporting this year is not duplicative of what got reported last year. And then, this is interesting, this slide is from the University of Kansas Community Toolbox, which I'm guessing most of you have have used at one time or another. But this idea also that the indicators should be challenging. They should stretch us to think about what we as community resource and economic development in extension want to be working on. And so more aspirational for the future. And you'll see in some of the comments from the survey that we got at a lot of these concerns about our current set of indicators, and we also got some really good ideas. So let me share with you a little bit about what we found out. First, in terms of who completed the survey, we had 113 at least partial responses where people at least answered some of the questions. And the breakdown regionally was about half of the respondents were from the North Central region and about a quarter from the West. And then it looks like about 12% from the Northeast and about, sorry, the numbers are kind of light, 13% from the South of 113 people. And then in terms of the roles people play, we asked about people's primary extension role, and we got a good mix of people. The biggest group was people who actually deliver community development programming. And then the second group was people who provide leadership for the community development programming. And we even got, 9 people who do evaluation or reporting work responding to the survey. We got mostly people from those 1862 institutions. We did get some responses from the 1890s, the historically Black colleges and universities, and 3 responses from people who work in 1994's tribal colleges. And as we go through the slides, I've tried to highlight some of the comments in particular that came from people from those institutions, the 1890s and the 1994s. The way the survey was designed is there was a skip question towards the beginning where we asked people what region of the country they're in. And for people in the West and the Northeast that have not been reporting indicators, they kind of skipped most of the survey and went to some questions that were broader at the end. But the people in the North Central regions and the North Central and Southern regions were asked these questions about each of the indicators they currently have in their region. And so one question for each indicator, there was a question about how strong is that indicator as a measure to inform policymakers? How well does it fit with the programming in your state? And how able to collect the data for that indicator are you? So kind of 3 dimensions of kind of quality of each indicator that we were asking about. So here's the here's the big table for the North Central region. And so I know you're not supposed to put slides like this together, but I figured, you know what? I think we can look at it and have this. This will be really useful background as we have this retreat coming up in mid-May to really think about which indicators seem to be working quite well and which indicators not so much. And as Michael mentioned, in the North Central region, we also know every year how many states are even able to report or do report on each indicator. And for some of them, we already knew that like half or fewer of the states were reporting on particular indicators, like such as the ones towards the bottom here. But what you can see is the first column is, and this is basically the percent who responded to a moderate or great extent. And so there's some support for this indicator. And so you could see, like, as a strong measure, a lot of them, are pretty strong measures, or at least people felt they were. And then in terms of fitting well with CRED programming, yeah, still pretty strong, except when you get down to the number of business plans, the number of businesses, the support for those indicators gets a lot lower. And then the able to collect data, that is really interesting. So none of the states really felt terribly strong about their ability to collect the data for these indicators. And so what I did is I kind of took an average across all 3 of those kind of different ways of measuring the quality of each indicator. to give an overall sense so I could sort these. And it gives you a pretty good feel. There's a pretty big gap between the one about number of community or organizational plans adopted and the next five after that. There's kind of a big drop off there. And, I'm not going to suggest what that means, but I think a lot of people will be able to use that information to help think about which of these might we want to keep and where might we want to develop perhaps some indicators that could be a little easier for people to collect. So we did the same thing with the South. And I can go back to these slides later for the discussion if people want to, but let me just give you the overview first. So in the Southern region, the number of plans, this first one has pretty strong support. Number of plans, new or revised, adopted that have begun to be implemented. So this kind of, is something people felt like they could report. That it was a strong measure of Extension CRED work. And then some of the other measures were felt to be pretty strong in the South as well. It's interesting because in the Southern region, they combine number of businesses created, retained, or expanded. So if the extension program is doing anything directly with businesses, they're able to just report on this one indicator, whereas in the North Central, that was separated into two indicators. Again, there's some, it's in the Southern region, all of these were felt to be pretty strong measures of Extension CRED work, but there is quite a bit of variation in the ability to collect the data. So especially this last one, dollar value of other in-kind resources contributed by organizations or communities. So we also had a lot of open-ended questions, which I think were very, very interesting. And I'm just going to walk you through some samples of some of the responses, because they really are pretty telling about the difficulties of doing something like indicators across a region. So with the indicator, and this is just for the North Central for the moment, but the indicator about participants reporting new leadership roles, one person wanted more clarity on what would be considered a leadership role and opportunity. So more specific definitions there. One comment that we gather this information already from our cohort programs and post-program surveys. I happen to know that response came from Minnesota. We also, a comment that shows how our programming this fits with our programming to build confidence and get people to take new roles. The indicator about dollar value of volunteer hours, people thought it's easy to estimate that dollar value based on, figures from, I'm not thinking of the organization right now, but you can get the dollar value of volunteer hours in every state and multiply that, but you have to have some sort of way to collect the number of volunteer hours. One respondent mentioned that they have a lot of stakeholders, but they don't often refer to them as volunteers. So that was interesting that there's kind of semantic differences that might get in the way. And one person commented, and this comment came up a lot, that requires long-term surveys. We can talk about that because there might be ways to get at this that it requires follow-up, but not necessarily a big survey. So some of the other comments we saw, the number of organizational or community plans or policies developed. So this also people thought was a good measure for the most part. But some concern that just developing the plan might not be enough. What we really want to see is implementation. And I know in the North Central region, there's a separate indicator focusing on the implementation. A comment here that this doesn't really measure the impact of the work. It's more an output, which is true. It's hard to have measures that really get at some of the impacts, and sometimes the outputs do tell you something really important about the work and what it's achieving. Um, the number of plans adopted, I think that the comments there, again, that it can be hard to collect. Sometimes this third comment, sometimes the adoption is out of Extension's hands and at the mercy of other factors, and that is definitely true. So there's a lot of reasons why maybe this isn't the strongest indicator. As for number of business plans, you know, in states that have a really close connection between Extension and their small business development center, they are able to report a lot of these numbers, but other states are not. So it kind of depends on whether the state is doing that work directly with business and it's connected with Extension. Same thing goes for the number of jobs created. One comment here, we do not have job creation as a goal for our team. This indicator about dollar value of grants generated. There's a comment here, and this came from someone who works for an 1890 university, that, you know, if we're able to quantify this, it's a good way to communicate the value of Extension work. But that it's not just about the dollar value of grants, but also about what they say here, the bonding and bridging within the community that we help create. Another comment that this is collectible, but sometimes the numbers are a little bit, we're not sure if they're valid, and they have to be vetted. And the third comment, I would say this is not a great indicator, but it is an indicator that speaks loudly to policymakers. It reflects a return on investment. And then the number of plans adopted that have begun to be implemented. This is, by the way, these are the Southern indicators. I don't think the higher number of plans indicates greater success. Rather, implementation of a couple of successful plans can be more effective. And again, this was a comment from a staffer at 1890. And then would love to know more about implementation than just making the plan. So we heard that comment before. And some other comments from the Southern region. The number of businesses looks good to a policymaker. Best way to note, so again, someone felt this was a good indicator to have. And another comment that this requires a fair amount of follow-up. Again, that comes up again and again as a concern. Similar comments about the number of jobs. If that's not a priority or that extension program is not set up to do work directly with businesses, it's hard to really measure this. But it could be a powerful way to tell a story to policymakers. This indicator in the Southern region, people tended to like, and there isn't a counterpart to this one in the North Central. Number of new alliances or networks formed. So there tended to be some pretty positive comments about this. But then there was this comment in green, this is important, but it shouldn't be an indicator since all of Extension does this, which is interesting. But I guess part of me feels like, well, that doesn't mean we in community development still can't report it. So another comment here from an 1890 staffer, yes, this is more important. As more networks and partnerships are created, there's a chance it will create more opportunities for the working age population. So then there was a question in the survey about areas of community development programming that the current set of indicators does not capture. And I'll just share a couple of slides about some ideas that came up there. This whole slide really is about what we would call community engagement or civic engagement programming. So people wanting indicators about new partnerships or collaborations, which they have in the South, but not in the North Central. Fostering community connections and engagement through dialogues and town halls, facilitated conversations, an indicator for community engagement. And this comment in the upper left, I'd prefer to report on something like communities taking action following extension engagement. Other areas where the current indicators are not addressing the work that's being done is there were several comments around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. One person recommending we look at the competencies that the extension around DEI that the Extension Foundation has published. A comment here in the upper right that indicators shouldn't solely be focused on the butts and seats, but how we innovatively created and implemented programming and show collaborative efforts. Other comments around food systems, community capacity building, such as disaster preparation, and partnering with communities to address big issues like food access or opioid or other substance misuse. And then some other areas, some ideas for future indicators on a couple slides. One idea about number of improvements made to physical spaces in cities and towns. One about community capacity building, such as disaster preparation. One about number of networks, partnerships, or collaborations created. A respondent commented that the Master Gardener program in their state has a lot of indicators we could look at. This one was residents that have modified existing practices that will assist with environmental stewardship and a sustainable community. And this gets at kind of another area generally around environmental sustainability or climate change that our current set of indicators does not address. Some other comments here for the future: we should also use storytelling and testimonials in the participants' words, and even showcase the impact on the extension staff. And then a comment from a staff member at a 1994 tribal college that for them, tribal integration into education and integration of culture and art, cultural arts and history into tribal extension programming would be an important thing to measure. So we're thinking about this gathering coming up in mid-May where we've invited people, and Michael will tell you who's coming to that. It's here in Minnesota in mid-May, to think through to brainstorm some ideas for indicators moving forward. And one possible way to do the work moving forward, which we asked about in the survey, is to frame the indicators around the community capitals framework, which almost all of us in community development and extension are familiar with and use often directly in our programming. And so we asked to what extent people would be supportive of the community capitals framework as a way to frame the indicators moving forward. And that got a lot of support among the survey respondents, as you can see. About 3/4 of the folks who responded said to a moderate or great extent. And there were some comments about that, but people thought that it would be good to help us capture both quantitative and qualitative information. It could encourage storytelling, and using that community capitals would keep the reporting in sync across all land-grant institutions and allow for diversity of thought. There was a concern about that we need to be mindful of how the community capitals framework is viewed from the tribal colleges. And so it might be good to have a conversation about ways that the CCF is not or could be made more a better fit for work in Native communities or with Native communities. And but in general, a lot of support for that idea, which I have to say I'm very supportive of as well. In Minnesota, we have a history of kind of coding all of our ripple maps according to the community capitals and coding sort of the outcomes of our annual program review according to the community capitals as well. So with that, this is an example of how we we had taken the capitals and we kind of split out health from human capital because so much extension programming is really focused on health outcomes for individuals and communities. But the idea of using a capitals framework is to have these categories of impact and give definitions to them that you can agree upon, and then come up with indicators and also narratives that highlight successes in each of these areas. So that's just an idea at this point, but hopefully something we can talk more about moving forward. So Michael, I will turn it back over to you to talk about, um, I'm sorry, I have one more slide. So we had these comments that, the numbers are good, but we need stories, we need narratives, and we already do those. So both the Southern region and the North Central region collect impact narratives, as does the USDA, NIFA in the annual accountability reports that each state has to do. So one thing moving forward is just to think through what kind of framework for those narratives we would want to use moving forward. And there are a couple of, there's lots of options there. The one on the left is, for example, the one that is from the USDA NIFA. The one on the right is one that I helped develop for public value posters, but it's similar to the USDA NIFA, except for this Y extension piece, which can be really important. So why is extension a better delivery organization than other organizations that are out there? What's the comparative advantage? And I feel like that could be a useful piece of impact narratives. It often has a lot to do with credibility and trust that other organizations just don't have. With that, then I will turn it back over to Michael.
I'll believe it when I see it. No, I'm only kidding, Scott. Yes, so I wanted to walk through the next steps. And after today, after hearing what we learned from the survey, the next step is May 14th and 15th. A group of us, there's about 30 to 35 of us meeting at the Community Development Indicators Retreat. It's going to be a 2-day working meeting that will be held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I want to point out that it's intentionally being held at Red Lake Nation's college site in Minneapolis. It was very important to us as organizers that we held it in a place where everyone, including our brothers and sisters at the 1994s, would feel like they belong, like they are included in this effort. And so we're actually going to be the first outside entity to host something or host an event, if you will, at Red Lake Nation College's site in Minneapolis. We're excited to be there. They're super excited to host us. But right now, we only have a couple of folks representing 1994s at this and at the 2-day meeting. NCRCRD has funding available to cover travel expenses for anyone from a 94 who's interested in participating in this. And while registration is closed and everything else for everyone else, I am personally inviting those folks that are from 1994s that are on this or wind up listening to this. Please get in contact with myself at wilcox16@purdue.edu. Or Serber at purdue.edu. Shelley, I think, is going to put our emails in the chat. Please contact us if you're interested in attending the retreat. We would love to have you. We definitely want to lift up the voices of the 1994s and find a way to do that. After the retreat, we're going to be processing all of that together as a group. And we will be then presenting the results to the national program leaders for community development at NACDEP on the 17th of June in Houston, Texas. And so we're excited to do that. It'll be great to see everyone from across the country. We do have a representative from the Northeast that's joining us in Minneapolis. We have a representative from the West that'll be joining us in Minneapolis. We have quite a few representatives from the 1890s, quite a few representatives from the South. And like I said, we're continue to work on making sure that we have representation from the 94s, at a minimum from the 94s in the North Central region. It is at the National Program Leaders meeting that we'll discuss further what the next steps look like and how to proceed. It is also important to us that we get input from NIFA, and so both Sarah Rocker and Brent Elrod have been invited to join us. I believe that Sarah is going to join us via Zoom. And so it's unclear whether Brent will be available to join us. But since they are joining us by Zoom, we're going to see if there are other national program leaders from NIFA that can join us as well. We want to be sure that this data is worthwhile to them, as well as worthwhile to all of us and our extension directors and others. We will then, as it's mentioned, program leaders will recommend a timeline for implementation. My guess is that this may be in a coordinated effort at the national level. It could be also at the regional level as well through PLN in the South and through the program leaders in the North Central region, and it'll be up to the West and the Northeast, or it may wind up being a cumulative national effort. It remains to be seen. Scott, Ann, and I are trying not to come in with too many priors. We're trying to come in with open minds, and hopefully everyone else will as well, and we'll come to an agreement as to how best to move forward. I guess next slide.
That's it.
Oh, that's it. Perfect. I'll give a shout out again to the North Central Cooperative Extension Association. They're the ones that gave us the seed funding to do this. And then the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, Southern Rural Development Center saw value in this as well. And so they wound up providing resources to make this a reality also. So I guess with that, we'll open it up for questions and comments and concerns.
And I'm happy to move the slides back to those tables if people want to see those again, or just let us know.
I have a question. How have you seen the indicators evolve over the last few years? Any major changes to them? Some of these I remember from when I started, and some I know that have changed, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
To my knowledge, the North Central indicators have not changed since they were first authored back in 2009. If they have changed, it may be definitionally speaking, or there may have been some massaging of the language, but I don't think that they've changed markedly since we first introduced them. Anne, you have more institutional knowledge than I do.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Emer, it could be that state by state, if the states would pick and choose what they thought was relevant in their states. So for example, those indicators about business success and jobs saved, et cetera, aren't really relevant in a lot of our states. So I know that some of the states haven't used those. So it did probably look like they changed over time. I'm guessing that it was just which of the indicators off this list your state was using. I think that's probably what was happening. And of course, states are, adding on their own tailored indicators. So, we would send out a request that would have, 10 of the 17 and 5 of them that I just wanted to collect for Illinois, for example. So that could also make it seem as if the indicators have changed, but from a central standpoint, they haven't changed.
I'll just add really quickly, and then I'll call on Mary and then Rachel. I will add that in terms of the qualitative stories that we have told, last year, 2 years ago, we included the innovation of trying to tag those stories or connect those stories to the thematic areas of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. It was actually quite easy to do that because Maria and I have created these very large buckets, if you will. Community resiliency is a pretty massive bucket. A lot can fit into that. Health and wellness is another pretty massive bucket. And then leadership and civic engagement, which is the bread and butter of many of the community development programs in the North Central region anyway. That's a pretty big bucket as well. We weren't too intense about it. We just simply had a color-coded dot next to each of the qualitative stories to help people understand sort of where they fit into things. But this is where we're going to need more information moving forward. Does that make sense to do that? Is it relevant to the 94s? Is it relevant to the 1890s and the programming that they're doing in this space? And how do we define this space for different places? NACDEP, we tried really hard at NACDEP to come up with a definition that made sense to all of us. I know Community Development Society has spent a lot of time setting up the ground rules of how we work with communities through the principles of good practice. But in terms of indicators, as well as how we tell our stories and what we're talking about and what we work on, I think are some critical conversations that we'll be having here at the retreat and moving forward. Mary, talk about institutional knowledge. You were there on the front lines, I think, as this was all being put together. So school us, please.
Well, the conversation just made me think back to how the community capitals framework originated, because I think people who roll their eyes about CCF probably don't have that history. But the community capitals framework came from the movement towards more asset-based community development. And then the question was, how do we help communities find their assets? And then we had the conversation about, well, if we give them some tools to help them think about where those assets are, then that'll help them see things that maybe they don't otherwise see. And in that sense, CCF was always meant to be context specific in its application, because each community has different assets. When we looked across the use of CCF, then we said, oh, we can see there's these 7 buckets that almost every community uses. Their indicators might be a little bit different, and how they use those assets to build other assets might be a little bit different, but there's these 7. What we've learned since, and some of you have been part of this, is I can go to some communities and they can say that those 7 buckets don't work for us. In particular, I've worked with 2 Native nations who said, no, I understand that you have these 7 things and that you think about religion and spirituality as being part of culture, but we don't think that way. So we can see how we could use this, but we need an 8th capital. Shauna, with her consulting firm, has said intellectual capital is different, and it's really important when we think about progress. So we think intellectual capital is important too. And, you know, you guys raised the idea of adding health and some of those other kind of things. So I think it's important to realize it's a framework. It's a tool that, to be effective, has to be adapted to the current use. It's not a formula to apply. The other thing that I think I was just thinking about, and I think this is kind of where community vitality is different from a lot of extension, is CCF was about community assets that can build other assets. So it was about capacity building. So when we look at what we're measuring things that mean the community has more people, more capacity, more knowledge, more connections to do more and better things, which is different than if I'm in some of the other extension programs where I'm measuring individual asset development. The group that works on 4-H, youth development and community development, what we've been trying to do is look at how youth play into those community-based assets in unique ways, but we've just been measuring how it makes them more successful in their career. So I think it really helps to think about this as a way to think about what we do in the community to help that community do more and better into the future, rather than here are the 7 things I'm supposed to pay attention to. Scott, and people have comments on that?
I mean, I hear the concern about what are the right, are there buckets that we could all agree on? And I would just hope that as we go through the discussion of the indicators that we think about, because I think some of the capitals haven't been paid attention to when thinking about indicators. And so, for example, when we hear that there's no indicators about DEI work, that if we had a framework like the capitals, it would move us towards, okay, for cultural capital, how are we going to measure that? So my point is just that I would want the indicators to be broad. I think right now they're kind of heavily biased on the financial side and the business side. So I would just want them to be a little more representative of all the work we do.
Mary, one of the important things I'm hearing from what you just described is the focus on community improvement. And I think that we're challenged in extension systems not to just count numbers of people who attended this or number of people who did this or that, but really what's community change? What are they doing collectively? What are they doing on a broader scale? We can report individual progress, but I think it's those community indicators that if you want to talk about like a comparative advantage, that's really where we are. So I like what you're saying about that broader view of the community driven, but also community measured change. And I think that would help us tell a really powerful story.
Yeah.
Which is the whole point of this.
Thank you, everyone. I don't want to lose the fact that Rachel did have her hand up. My BFF has her hand up right now, so I want to make sure that Stacy is able to ask her question. But Rachel, I just wanted to honor the fact that you did have your hand up at one point. Did you have something you'd like to add?
No worries. I just stuck it in chat anyway. So the South started in 2014 with 9 indicators. That was our first pilot year. The next year we dropped 3, added 1. So since 2015, we've had the same list.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank
sorry,
you.
I got that wrong in my slides.
No worries. You were
Oh,
close.
We can always change the slides before we upload them to
2014.
the NCRCRD site. Stacy, school us.
Well, I was also just going to add, in the South, when we've talked about indicators, one of the things that was really important to us always is we know there are some indicators that some states don't or institutions don't report to, and there are others that they are. And that was always what we tried to do is make sure we had a range so that everybody felt like they had something that they could contribute, even though it may not encompass the breadth of programs that they have. We wanted to make sure, because when you go to, especially our 1890s, a lot of their programs look very different than our 1862 programs. And so making sure that we were honoring things that seemed to fit. That said, I don't know that they're still, I think we've been talking about reviewing those for a couple of years and have been taking some steps to do that. Because I think, when I think about things like housing and some of those other areas that our people are working in, we don't have indicators that necessarily are intuitive to that. So I just think it's important to remember that just because maybe only 40% or 20% highlighted a particular indicator compared to 80% on another doesn't mean that that indicator isn't important, because that may be the only place that a particular institution could find a home. And we want to make sure we reflect that at the regional level.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Stacy. I know that like Missouri, for example, because the SBDCs are housed in Extension, they're able to hit grand slams every year on all of that business data and show a lot of impact. And so that's something that I think that they've appreciated that we've included for sure. And there are certainly others. I did want to lift up that Janice wrote something in the chat. As a former extension director in '94, it would have been very difficult for me to address the indicators on this slide. And I don't want to put Janice on the spot, but I'll put her on the spot and see if she wants to talk a little bit more and help us understand why it would have been difficult. And I'll preface by saying that I just had that lived experience up at White Earth and Red Lake, where we did some workforce development training with the Forward curriculum. And within the first 5 minutes of the training, we realized that our definition of workforce development and their definition of workforce development were not in the same place, and that the 7 community capitals didn't really resonate with them, and that they preferred that we speak in terms of the 7 teachings of the Anishinaabe, of the grandfathers, instead of talking about the 7 capitals. And so there was a lot of deliberation that I guess I wish I had done prior to starting the training, so I would have been better prepared to do that. So do you want to talk a little bit more about your experience and why this would have been difficult for you?
Sure. So when I was extension director, we just we didn't measure the things that were on there. We didn't, there wasn't any place most of the numbers for me, if I was reporting, the numbers of people who did most of these things, it would be zero, because you just don't within especially a small tribal community, you're not going to have huge numbers of people well, you might have organizations writing grants, but it would be hard to get to the people to find out who that is, because it wasn't us with Tribal College Extension that was helping people do that. It was more tribal in nature. So you have the tribe that kind of does their stuff, and then you have Extension, which works through the college. And we work more, it's more community. So we might have some indicators. For example, if you have a farmer's market and you have some people who grow gardens and bring produce to the farmer's market, then you may have those numbers, but there aren't going to be a whole lot of the other numbers where you're actually going to see, you might get one, but most of them are going to be zeros. So I know there was another slide in here where the questions were a little bit different. And if they're framed a little bit differently, then I think, that would help. The other thing that would help, though, is that when you go through, and I've written the Tribal Colleges Extension grants, I think I wrote it like 3 times, and there is a piece in there for evaluation, but none of this stuff is actually, if you kind of build it in to where you have your objectives and your activities and how you're going to evaluate that, and you come up with that whole plan to do that, then you might be able to get some of those answers. But most tribal colleges, now that I'm national program leader with USDA NIFA now, I've been in the position for 1.5 years. And I read a lot of the reports, and a lot of the reports are, and even mine was very much like we had this many programs and this many participants. We're not really reporting on the big picture, which I now understand as a national program leader working with tribal programs, that these are a lot of the stories. This is what really goes under your accomplishment section, not just, we had 10 people, join this workshop and 5 people. So there really has to be, and one of the things that I work on is really doing more education, with what we want to see within the reports to actually get to some of these community numbers, and how it really, how it all kind of fits together. So it's just, I think it's a lot of education, teaching from the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just learned a lot in the matter of 2 minutes. And so I really appreciate that input, Janice. And you and I have to follow up about a whole bunch of things, but I will follow up with you on this. So thank you very much for that. I know that we're running out of time. Maria, do we have time for one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Maria has generously endowed us with the opportunity to ask one more question. Would anyone like to take her up on that offer?
Hi, my name's Carissa Bishop. I'm with a very small nonprofit, and sorry, I don't know if anyone else was gonna go. I wasn't looking up.
You're good.
I'll try to be. I'm just curious. I know, at least my understanding of extension programs, and this is my first webinar, I believe, with you guys. But yeah, my understanding is that they're typically housed within a university. Is that correct? Or I'm just curious, and like, as a small organization, nonprofit, 501c3, how can I go about partnering with my local extensions?
Wow. I think everyone on the call, whether you can see their face or not, is smiling right now, because as community development extension professionals, this is the type of thing that brings warmth to our hearts, for sure. So I guess the first question would be, what state are you in? And once you tell us what state you're in.
I'm in Oregon.
Oregon. Okay. So in Oregon, and I'm not as familiar with the tribal colleges in Oregon. There must be tribal colleges in Oregon, and Janice will school us on that and let us know which ones are there, since I'm in the North Central region. But Oregon State University is your 1862 land grant. And even if you're a duck and not a beaver, the beavers will still work with you. Janice, what tribal colleges are in Oregon?
No tribal colleges in Oregon.
Okay, no tribal
But
colleges.
but Oregon State actually has a federally recognized tribes extension program, so
Okay.
a FERTEP program, and they specifically work with tribes within Oregon. So
Okay.
even though they don't have a tribal college, that would be getting hold of Oregon State, their FERTEP program.
Yeah. So Oregon State houses the extension program. They have programs in a wide range of areas. As Janice just said, they have a FERTEP program as well, which means they have some special programming that's done with the Native American communities that are there in Oregon. But getting in touch with Oregon State Extension is a great first step. You can take a look at their website, see what sort of programming is going on in 4-H youth development, or family and consumer science, or in ag and natural resources, or in community development, which we're talking about today. And if I remember correctly, Oregon State, I used to house the Western Rural Development Center. They've had great researchers throughout the years working in rural development and all different aspects of community development. So I think you'll be well served by Oregon State. However, there are about 110 of us in the country, 110 land grant institutions, or roughly in the entire United States. We all work on different things. We all have different specialties. This particular group assembled today is working in community development in a wide range of areas. It could be in leadership and civic engagement. It could be community planning. It could be community economics, workforce development, community health. There's a myriad of things that we work on here, and we love working with 501c3s. For sure. The nonprofit sector is a sector that we love working with, and feel free, to reach out. You've got our contact information at the North Central Regional Center. Your regional center is housed at the University of Idaho at the Western Rural Development Center, and they serve all the land grant institutions in the Western region, and definitely reach out to Oregon State.
Perfect question to end the webinar, actually. I know this looks like there's going to be tons of great discussion at the May meeting to move this forward. And so thank you. Thank you for our speakers and for all the questions and comments and discussion. This was a great webinar. We look forward to seeing you later on in May at our next webinar. So Carissa, you are welcome to join us at any time. Our next webinar is on leadership development. So this be great. And for all, have a great weekend. Okay, I guess tomorrow's Friday, so the week hasn't ended yet, but for those who end on Thursday, have a great weekend. Otherwise, we'll see you a little bit later in May.